Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you're joining us from around the globe. My name is Winfred Amwako, and I am the growth marketing lead here at Akiva, and we are super excited to have you all join us today. So today's discussion is going to be on the topic of hierarchical planning, S&OP, into brackets IBP, to sales and operations execution. So our presenter today is by name Tepan, and he is going to have a quick introduction of himself. Tepan, can you say hello to our guest, please, to our audience, please?
Hello, good morning, everyone. This is Tapan Malik. I am a solution advisor with Arkiva, and I have been working in the supply chain space for over 20 years. So I'll be presenting the hierarchical planning concept to you this morning.
Awesome. We are super excited to have you join us, Tepan. Our name is Akiva, and Akiva is used around the globe, and we have been here since 1993. We've been in the supply chain space for over a decade, and we have expanded our tentacles across the globe to Southeast Asia, North America, and Asia Pacific. We are also a specialized supply chain software company, and we've been recognized in this year's Gartner MQ for supply chain planning. We've been recognized as the S&OP leader, as a visionary in the S&OP solution leader for this year, 2021. And also we have 17,000 users across the globe, which is a huge number. And we are used by companies with revenues of over $70 billion in revenue plan using Akiva. We are also industry agnostic, and we also have offices across the globe, like Asia Pacific, Europe, and Southeast Asia as well. But before we get into the weeds of today's discussion, I want to give a quick introduction on how we help businesses go about their supply chain planning. So we here at Akiva believe that improved business performance starts with better planning, and as a result, we have only one goal in mind, and that goal is always to help you to achieve better planning goals without forcing you to fit a software mode. So usually the big companies, the big supply chain companies like SAP and the rest, all of them try to sell your solution, but we sell you a customized solution that fits into your business. So we don't necessarily change the way you do your thing. We come in, understand your problems, and then we build a solution, or we fit our solution into your business to make it very easy for all those siloed departments within your supply chain, like demand planning, supply planning, all those individual departments who don't necessarily work together. We find a way to put all of them together so that they can collaborate using the same number that cuts across all departments, which is huge for many supply chain companies. Can you imagine using one number across board from finance teams to demand planners? That is awesome for supply chain managers as well to have in their daily processes. And so this gives you the power to really steer your business forward to the next level. And so I want to give a quick introduction or quick overview of what our full solution is all about. So our full solution is defined as one plan S&OP, which is integrated demand-driven sales and operations planning process for dynamic business performance, which helps to promote the cross-functional synchronization across the company, starting from integrated financial planning, real-time demand planning, optimize inventory management, demand and synergy, and supply synergy. So all this brings the whole solution under one platform, which means that now, as I said before, you're all working off the same number. And so that makes all your planning sessions really enjoyable, which means that you can have more time to play with your kids. You can have more time to watch all the soap operas or episodes on Netflix, wherever, and you have all the time to really have spend more time with your family and so on and so forth. So we give the solution that relieves you of all those trouble and all those time that you can rather be enjoying your time with your friends. And so I want to pass on the baton, or the next slide, to Tepan to help us to go through today's discussion. So Tepan, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Sorry, we are having a little difficulty with the technology today for some reason. So hope you can see my screen. Hello?
Yes, we can see your screen loud and clear. Yes, we can see your screen, Tevin.
Okay, very good. Good morning, everyone. I'm very happy to be here sharing my experience of the implementation of the hierarchical planning. It's going to be a long and tight presentation, so I will move a little fast. If you at any point have any question, feel free to submit your question and I'll try to answer it as much as I can. So the agenda is that we'll start with with an overview of the hierarchical planning. It will be at a very high level. Because of the lack of time, we are not going to be able to get into a lot of the details. And then we'll touch upon the demand planning, aggregate supply planning, the monthly process, and the IR MDR, which is the terminology that is used for the S&OP, IBP, where the financial reconciliation of the demand supply plan, and then the MDR stands for the executive S&OP. So those are all monthly process. Then we transition, and then once the monthly process is created, then this monthly process gets communicated across the organization, and then we start the weekly process. And the weekly process should really drive the daily process of the scheduling. And this is something that generally the most organizations do not do. And so this is the whole purpose of this presentation, as to make you aware that there is a lot of benefit in driving your business according to your strategy, rather than just reacting to a single customer order. So what is hierarchical planning? So as I said, the hierarchical planning is really a way to drive your business based on your S&OP plan. So that is kind of in a nutshell, the hierarchical planning. Now, the implementation that we are talking about, I mean, so in any implementation, we start with some the focus area. So for example, we try to improve the demand forecast accuracy. We try to optimize the planning process based on the business strategy. We try to optimize the fixed asset utilization. We try to optimize the inventory placement and distribution. And also we try to improve the accuracy and efficiency of production planning and scheduling. So those are the areas that we target in any supply chain planning implementation. So the benefit that we get out of this, and we target the benefits out of this, so out of this implementation is to increase the revenue and decrease the variable cost of operations, so that we increase the gross margin. By reducing the inventory, we try to decrease the working capital, and through improved planning, we reduce the distribution cost, we increase the supply chain efficiency and reliability, and we increase the delivery to promise. So, we are going to start with the hierarchical planning overview. So this is a little bit of a busy chart, but we are going in stages, and I will explain things along the way, and we'll be bringing this chart multiple times along the course of the presentation so that you are familiar with it. So there are two areas in the business that kind of like so the demand is the one that drives the supply chain. So these are the, and so we will start with the monthly planning process. So the demand planning monthly process, generally you define some attribute to represent your demand plan. So for example, you have a customer in a region like Europe, in a country like France, so then your attribute would be customer, region, country, just as an example. Then you create a demand plan based on the statistical forecasting, collaborative forecast input, and the product life cycle. Then once you have a demand plan at an aggregate product family level in monthly bucket, you release that to the aggregate supply plan. This demand plan is with priority. So you have like a ABC customer, then you have to attach the priority to this demand, and then that gets transferred to the aggregate supply planning process. Then we also then generate some inventory targets. Inventory targets is at a product family level and with some postponement objectives. Then these two, so the demand plan and the inventory targets gets fed into aggregate supply plan, where you run the aggregate supply plan at a product family level. And you use the differential management through priorities. As I said, I mean, the demand comes with the ABC segment priorities. And so if you are constrained in raw materials or constrained in resources, then you have to sort of figure out what strategy you use to fulfill the customer demand. And when you are tight in your capacity or the raw materials, then you have to create some kind of a scenarios to close the gap. And then so you create a balanced plan that balances the demand and supplies, and then you communicate that balanced plan to the demand planning and the IR, MBR. IR stands for integrated reconciliation, and MBR stands for management business review. The purpose of the integrated reconciliation is really at a high level, the dollarization of the plan. So looking at the financial impact of the plan. So from aggregate plan, two things happen. One is that you have a balanced plan, supply demand plan. So balanced supply demand plan gets communicated back to the demand, and the demand then sends the approved, the unconstrained demand plan to the IR, and then the constrained demand plan or the balanced supply demand plan gets sent to the IR by the aggregate supply plan. And once it is sent, then in IR you review the base case and then the scenarios, and then those multiple scenarios then get sent to the management business review. And then in management business review, executives look at those plans and then they approve one of them for adoption. Then that approved consensus plan gets communicated to the business for execution. So at the conclusion of the integrated reconciliation process, the approved consensus plan then gets sent back to demand, and then the demand actually disaggregates that product family level monthly bucket demand into SKU level weekly bucket demand, and then sends it to the master production scheduling. The aggregate supply plan sends the aggregate production target to MPS, where then it gets broken down into the mixed level plan. So in the master production schedule, we actually have implemented the MPS, the DRP and MRP in a weekly bucket, and they all happen simultaneously and continuously, concurrently. So the MPS then, so here aggregate plan creates the target for MPS. Similarly, MPS creates the target for the detailed scheduling. So this downward arrow actually indicates that the MPS target gets sent to the detailed scheduling. Now, when you are in the detailed scheduling, you have some kind of a frozen and slushy horizon where you create the planned order and process order, and they are all actually sent to the ERP system. So they're kind of fixed. So once you zero in on those plan on the shop floor level, then those fixed plan in the form of like a fixed quantities then get sent back to the MPS, which is this upward arrow indicates. And similar thing happens in the daily DRP MRP process, where you have a weekly DRP MRP targets, and then on a daily basis you sort of create a deployment plan to replenish the stock at the warehouses. So those happen at the daily level. And then the detailed scheduling, as I said, you create a planned order and process order. They are all gets created in the ERP system. Similarly, the deployment transport order and the purchase order, they all get created in the ERP system. and the sales order management happens in the ATP system. And then the one other process that we recommend is that, so you create a plan, but the plan hardly happens as planned. I mean, so there are some deviations from the plan versus the actual. And so we introduced a concept of like a weekly demand supply reconciliation process where you look at the plan versus actual. And on a weekly basis, you do take some gap closing activities and update the plan as you go, and make sure that you create keep track of the original plan and the changes in the plan. Similarly, it happens on the daily reconciliation process also. So for example, in the daily scheduling, you scheduled a production for a particular order of 100 units, and let's say you ended up with a 90, so there is a gap. So on a daily basis, you sort of meet for a short period of time to figure out like what to do. So you ship 90 and ask for delayed shipment of 10, or maybe you ask for some delay and make up for those lost quantities of 10 units and send the 100 units later on. I mean, those are all part of the daily reconciliation process. So as you can see here, we started with an aggregate level monthly plan that then gets transferred to the weekly level, SKU level weekly plan. Then that gets transferred to the SKU level daily plan. Then that gets connected to the execution system. And then from the execution system, we bring in some quantities that are fixed, and then we create a feedback loop that then that feeds back to the aggregate planning system and the S&OP system. So so that's the at a high level hierarchical planning concept, and how different, and we demonstrated how different planning components sort of work together in this plan. This is a very busy chart, but my purpose to show this was to show you, like, for example, so this is the month of April, and in the month of April, so let's say in the month of March, towards the end, you actually start your stat forecasting process, your product input process, the sales and marketing input process, and you bring all those things and you bring it to the, I hope you see my cursor. You bring into the workday one and create an initial consensus demand plan that is based on the stat forecast, sales and marketing input, product input, customer input. And then you go through the review process. I mean, this was a global business, so we had a sub-regional demand review process. I mean, if your business is not as large, then you may just get by with the regional demand review and global demand review. But in our case, we started with the sub-regional demand review, then the regional demand review, and then the global demand review. And then we created an unconstrained consensus demand plan that got sent to the supply, where supply actually ran an aggregate planning model and created a balanced demand supply plan. Excuse me. And then once the balanced supply demand plan is created, then you go through the global supply review process, and then once the global supply review happens, then you go send this demand plan, the supply plan, to the regional IR process, global IR process, and then you go to the global executive review, which is called global MBR process, and then you communicate that demand, communicate that plan to the organization. And on the left side, you see here the global demand review happens on workday 5. Global balanced supply demand review happens on workday 9. Global supply review happens on workday 12. And the global IR happens on the workday 14, and global MBR happens on workday 15. And on workday 16, the approved consensus plan, which is really the S&OP plan, that gets communicated to the organization. So that is really gets communicated for execution. So now that we talked about the overall, gave you overall picture, we'll touch upon the key steps here. So first of all, we'll start with the demand planning process. And then we'll talk about the aggregate planning process and the integrated reconciliation process and the master production scheduling process, and how sort of you go from step to step. So in the previous discussion, we said that that the aggregate supply plan sends you a balanced plan to to IRMBR. And in the demand plan, actually, you also make sure that you have your system supports easy aggregation, disaggregation of the hierarchy and the plan. And so the make sure that your demand plan kind of is aligned with the sales order data. So as an example, let's say your customer orders 100 kilogram every October for the past 3 years. But because of some manufacturing glitches for the last 2 years, the order was pushed out to November. So in year 4, when you forecast this customer, then you forecast the 100 kg of the product for October, not November. That is the point. So you use the actual customer intent for demand forecasting. Another key point I wanted to make here is that we are talking about a demand plan and not stat forecast. Stat forecast is one of the components of the demand plan. The demand plan should have all sources of demand. So the sales and marketing input, customer input, product input, they all needs to be factored in, and the demand plan also needs to align with the strategy and the business goal. So that is what demand plan is about. So it's a little bit more than that. So I just wanted to make that point. And this point is not very well understood because people do stat forecasting and then they think that that is the demand plan. It is more than that. Now, so we talked about the stat forecasting, we talked about the sales and marketing input, customer input. Now, how do you determine, like you have hundreds of thousands of sales order, and how do you determine which one to forecast statistically and which one to forecast through sales and marketing input? So you go through some differentiated forecasting strategy analysis where you create a 2x2 matrix. The x-axis is product importance and y-axis is the predictability. So the grid 1 and grid 3, so they are like high importance, low importance, but they are all highly predictable, and they are the ones that you use for stat forecasting. Then the grid 2 is like the product is important, but the product is unpredictable. So don't waste time stat forecasting this product. So this is the candidate for the sales forecasting, and the sales and marketing input and the customer input should be applied to the grid 2. And grid 4, low importance and unpredictable, this is something that you don't try to forecast at all. You just use some kind of a min-max strategy, and we have different ways of handling this, but this is not there is no point in it, trying to forecast this. And so here we touch upon the concept of communication of plans. So right now we have like 3 things. So one is the unconstrained consensus demand plan that happens at the end of the demand review. This is unconstrained, meaning you don't know whether or not you have the resources or capacity in your organization to meet that demand. It is that's why it is called unconstrained consensus demand plan. It is at an aggregate location, product family, priority level, and this gets sent to the aggregate supply plan. Now, aggregate supply plan, then it's a model. It runs the aggregate supply plan to create a balanced plan, and then the master planner communicates that demand supply balanced plan to the demand planner. And so the purpose of this communication is to highlight the unfulfilled demand and the constraints that are there in the organization to the demand planning people to understand like what can be done to address the gap. So we'll come to that later. And then there is approved consensus plan, which is really the S&OP plan. And this is actually a key step where the approved consensus plan needs to be disaggregated and communicated at the right level of detail for execution by all functions. So we talked about the demand plan. So now we are going to talk about the aggregate plan monthly process. So it is highlighted here in this diagram in the red rectangle. So we talked about the demand plan. Demand plan actually has given the unconstrained consensus demand plan to the aggregate plan. So aggregate supply plan kind of starts from there. It also has the aggregate inventory targets. So essentially, there are 4 steps in this process. First of all, you generate an aggregate planning run, the base and the scenarios. Why you need scenarios? Anytime you have some gaps because of the lack of raw materials or the capacity constraint, you have some gaps. And so you have to create some scenarios to close the gaps in multiple different ways, and each one of those have a financial ramification of the organization. So once you create those base scenario and the alternate scenarios, then you go through some kind of an evaluation process, and then you go through you adjust the plan to close the gaps. And then once you agree on, let's say, a couple of scenarios and the gap closing options, then you finalize the aggregate planning run. So those are the 4 steps. So evaluate plan or scenario. So you created a base plan, so you're trying to evaluate. So how do you evaluate? So you need a report. So this is where I think the reporting mechanism, a strong reporting mechanism is very important. Make sure that your planning system kind of supports it. So you review the unfulfilled demand and forecast variance. And then you review the materials and look at the purchases, look at the production volumes, look at the inventory levels. And then you look at the resources, so like how the capacity is being used, utilized, available hours, campaign windows. So here's an example of the capacity utilization, just an example of report. So for example, on the first graph here, you see the high capacity utilization for 2 months, and then there is no more utilization. So you better look as to why that is happening. In the bottom graph, there is a high utilization on a continuous basis, and it's a constrained resource. That probably is not a good thing. So, and it could become a potential source of unfulfilled demand. So look at that. So this is just an example. So once you go through the evaluation phase, then you need to get into the gap closing mode, where you adjust the plan to close gaps. So first of all, you need to maintain some kind of like a change log. So for example, you increase the campaign size window from, let's say, 8 hours to 12 hours. So create a change log so that you know what you changed in what scenario, so that you know where the change came from. So that is very important. And then you test scenarios in aggregate planning for like a early production or alternate supplier, etc. Then you create and evaluate alternate supply demand options to close gaps and meet financial objectives. And then you work with the demand for priority with the master production scheduler for resources, and have master data corrected as needed. So closing aggregate planning gaps. So this is an example. There are multiple ways to do it. So for example, if there are any issue with the lead time, like delays, then maybe you might want to work with your vendor for expedited shipment. You need to engage your master production scheduler and material planner, make sure that whatever you do at the aggregate level kind of like stays in sync with the execution level weekly bucket. You may want to review the transportation lane, accuracy of the transportation lane, where you have the right mode included, right lead time included or not. In capacity gap closing option involving capacity, you may want to increase the, again, you need to work with the master production scheduler or the asset scheduler and try out some of the concepts like the increasing the shifts, like I add a third shift, for example, or maybe increase the rates temporarily, and then extend the campaign window from, let's say, 8 hours to 16 hours, or the shift campaign window from, let's say, that was supposed to begin at 12 noon, maybe you start at 8 o'clock. So make it early, make it so that it changes your product availability, review the downtime. I mean, these are some of the things that you look at as the gaps closing option. And each time you enact in one of those gap closing options, then you create a scenario because the impact might not be obvious, and make sure that you keep a change log. So you went through the gap closing options, and now you have to finalize the aggregate planning run. So you need to, so once you go through this gap closing option, in a large business, you may have more than one master planner in different regions. So make sure that you are aligned with the regional master planners. If you have only one master planner in the business, then this step probably is not necessary, but in general, you align with the master planners to load the selected changes into base plan and take the final optimizer run, and use change log to track which options are loaded into plan. Then the final optimizer result is then used to create the supply review package, because you just ran the report. I mean, you have not reviewed the plan with other stakeholders in the organization, like the technology manager, the operations manager, the sales and marketing team. So you need to create a supply review package, and also a IR package that is going to get reviewed in the IR meeting. And then once you create that, then you send that IR package to the MBR meeting, where the changes or decisions from the SR, IR, and MBR should be reflected into the cycles aggregate plan in order to constrain the demand before it is released to MPS. So the MBR might choose let's say you sent a base plan that you think is appropriate, but the management might pick one of the scenarios instead. So if that gets selected, then that aggregate, the approved consensus plan, then needs to be incorporated into your aggregate supply planning, which is kind of might happen in the late in the cycle. And the SR stands for supply review. IR is, as I said, integrated reconciliation. It's basically the dollarization at a high level, dollarization of the supply plan. Essentially, you look at the financial impact of the supply plan, supply and demand plan. So we finished the aggregate planning. So now the aggregate plan actually created a supply review package. The demand plan has created a unconstrained consensus demand plan. So now you are ready for the integrated reconciliation and management business review process, which is a monthly process. And then once the MBR process is done, then you need to communicate that monthly plan for communication. So, so as you can see here, they approved the unconsensus constrained demand plan comes from the demand planning to IR. The balanced supply demand plan comes from the aggregate plan to IR, and those are the two inputs. And so we are going to talk about what happens basically here. So again, we go back to the workday calendar here. So now we have been through the demand review, supply review. These are all happened. So now we are down to in this particular case, regional IR, which may or may not happen for you, but definitely the global IR will happen for you. So that is the workday 14. then the global MBR, and then the workday 16, you communicate the approved consensus plan, which is really the S&OP plan. So here we kind of laid out on a you have the global product review, the global demand review, global supply review. So now we are on the 6th step, which is approve and communicate plans on the workday 13 through 15. So the global integrated reconciliation and the global MBR. So those are the two happens on workday 14 and 15. So here are the things that happen. So the different roles. So the finance kind of takes the lead in the IR meeting, the integrated reconciliation, because as we said, the finance takes the lead in identifying the financial impact of a plan that has been created by supply and demand. So regional IR, if there is one, then you conduct the global IR, and then you facilitate the global MBR, and then the approved prioritized gap fill. And then finance actually takes the lead in creating the approved consensus plan, and then the documents, agreements, actions, and plan changes. The demand participates in the regional IR if there is one, and then they participate in the global IR because the unconstrained consensus plan, its impact, the financial impact on the organization, that's what they need to contribute. They also participate in global MBR. So then once the MBR creates the approved consensus plan, then the approved consensus plan gets communicated to the supply. The supply then updates the aggregate plan with gap closing options, which came from the approved consensus plan. Now, the demand actually takes the approved consensus plan, which is at a product family level in a monthly bucket. So the demand disaggregates that monthly product family level demand into weekly demand at the SKU level, and then it sends to MPS. The demand also actually creates a copy of the approved consensus plan. The copy is called adjusted ACP. The reason for that is that when you are executing a plan, there are some discrepancies that might happen because of the realities of the real life. And so there's a weekly demand supply reconciliation process, and there is a daily demand supply reconciliation process. And you capture the deviations from the plan in the adjusted ACP so that you have a copy of the original plan, and then you have a copy of the adjusted plan. And then and that's how you keep track of it. And the finance again takes the responsibility to, so you saw how supply got a copy, demand got a copy, but that actually all is the responsibility of finance to communicate the approved consensus plan to the supply demand team. And then they also archive the older version of the S&OP plan. So we completed the S&OP process or the IBP process. We talked about the aggregate demand plan, aggregate supply plan, the IR-MBR process, and how it gets communicated to the organization. So as we saw in the last slide, that the approved consensus plan got incorporated in the aggregate supply plan, and approved consensus plan then gets disaggregated to at the SKU level weekly bucket and gets communicated to the master production scheduling. So now master production scheduling has a demand that has been approved by the senior executive. Now it is at a SKU level weekly bucket. So now we are going to talk about the master production scheduling. So as you can, so we talked about the demand plan, aggregate plan, and then the how it gets disaggregated. We talked about the disaggregation of the demand plan that gets communicated to the master production scheduling. And then the approved consensus plan that got incorporated into the aggregate supply plan, that actually sets the target for MPS. So that is this downward arrow, as you see here. So now in this diagram, we actually want to show you how we showed that the top-down approach of the communicating the higher level plan to the lower level plan. I mean, how the higher level plan sets the target for lower level plan. However, when you execute, there are some deviations from the actual, and that needs to be incorporated back into your higher level plan so that the plan remains in sync. So this is what we are going to explain in this chart. So the demand actually, let's say 2 to 3 years out, at the product family level, monthly bucket. So that's the forecasted through the multi-view process, which is the stat forecasting, sales marketing input, customer input, and all that. So we call that multi-view process. So you create the demand, and that demand is unconstrained consensus forecast, which we feed to the aggregate plan. An aggregate plan then is created, and then aggregate plan creates the target for the master production scheduling, and master production scheduling actually creates the target for the detailed scheduling. Okay, so the detailed scheduling creates a target. So now you, based on the target, you create the production schedule in the continuous time bucket. Then you create a frozen and slushy horizon. In the frozen horizon, the product has already been scheduled, the raw materials have been ordered, the process order has been released to the ERP system. You do not allow that to be changed. That's frozen schedule. No changes. Then the slushy horizon, no changes in the quantity, but you can change the time. So that's slushy. And in liquid horizon, you can change the time and the quantity both. Now the slushy, you create the process order. For frozen, you release, you already have converted the process order into the production order in the ERP system. So these are all kind of like a cast in stone sort of. The frozen definitely is, and the slushy is, and there should not be, I mean, if you change the slushy, there has to be some very high level approval process in the system. So anyway, so the frozen and slushy, so you fix these production orders into the early part of the MPS. And so this is the fixed part. And so when you run the MPS, then you see the ramifications of changes in the scheduling now gets reflected in the MPS horizon in the future green part of the horizon. Now, so from here, then you feed the MPSDS part into the aggregated planning portion, and you fix this part in the aggregate planning, and then you rerun your aggregate plan to see the ramifications of the fixed orders that came from the scheduling to the MPS to the aggregate plan, the ramifications of the fixed part of the plan on the green side, which is like the more open. So that's how you establish the feedback loop from the top to bottom and bottom to up. And that's a really key step that you need to understand and implement in your implementation. So the MPS, just like aggregate plan, it has essentially 4 steps. You basically create a preliminary master production schedule, and then you go through the post MPS run. You go through some analysis, and you go through the gap closing process, and then you finalize the MPS run. So the post MPS run, you review the consolidated production requirements, look at the forecast, look at the safety stock targets, look at the inventory levels. And then you review the consolidated resource requirements as needed. And then you evaluate the MPS for feasibility and alignment for explanation log, and look at the explanation logs from the optimizer. Then you go through the capacity constraints, lead time analysis, look at the lead time constraints. And then you go to go through the process of trying to close those gaps. So create and evaluate alternate supply demand options to close MPS gaps and meet financial objectives. So here are some examples, like as we said, showed in the supply demand, the aggregate planning gap closing option. You go through the lead times or go through the capacity, and then you expedite. or make changes in the T lane, or you increase the capacity by increasing the shift. You extend the production campaign, you shift the campaign, review downtime, and alternate. So make sure that the gap closing options are logged so that you know where the changes are coming from. Otherwise, you will be at a loss to explain your output because you don't know what you changed and what is causing the changes in the output. So that's why it is very important to maintain the change log before you create a scenario. You need to create a scenario in which you can work on the several options. And also as part of the scenario, you may find it useful to create fixed orders in order to assess the impact of a specific changes to the generated plan. So once you go through the gap closing options, then you incorporate that into your MPS. There are things that you may have to adjust or fix, and then you need to rerun the MPS to see the ramifications of those changes into your MPS planning horizon. So we finished the weekly master production scheduling process, and as we mentioned the master production scheduling process, our recommendation is that you run it in conjunction with the DRP and MRP on a weekly basis. So now you have, see in DRP you have like a weekly quantities, but it does not tell you like how much to ship. So there is no transport order. So the daily DRP MRP process actually looks into the reorder point triggers from your warehouses, and then it creates a daily deployment plan. Then in the ERP system, as you see in the execution process, you create a transport order, or for material requirements, you create the purchase order. So that's all the daily process. And then also we talked about the asset scheduling a little bit. So you get the MPS to create the asset schedule on a daily basis on a continuous time horizon, the frozen, slushy, and the liquid. And then the frozen part gets converted to the production order in the ERP system. And also the sales order processing kind of processes the order. The two processes that we talked about, the weekly demand supply reconciliation process, we probably have not touched upon that too much. But the importance of that is to make sure that you maintain a log of the discrepancy between planned versus actual on a weekly basis through MPS, and on a daily basis through the production scheduling. And these are all like the weekly demand supply reconciliation is a weekly meeting with the master production scheduler, and the daily reconciliation process is a daily meeting with the asset scheduler, the sales and marketing folks, just to resolve the discrepancies that are happening on a daily basis and on a daily basis. So that's the hierarchical planning all the way from S&OP to the execution. And as I showed you, the top down versus the bottom up, both needs to happen and needs to be very well designed through the proper data structure in the planning engine that you have. So this, in summary, the hierarchical planning is composed of 3 levels. The top level is the monthly bucket, S&OP, IBP, spanning 2 to 3 years out. Tactical planning, which is 6 to 12 months out, that is the MPS, MRP, DRP. And then the operational planning also on a daily basis, the asset scheduling, the daily DRP, MRP, that's on a daily bucket. You need to make sure that the planning engine is, the database associated with that is capable of properly defining the product and planning data hierarchy. That is really the crucial to the success of this work. And you define the relationship between the manufacturing view and demand management view in the data hierarchy. So for example, you have a product that you are selling in a market segment. Now, when you want to make that product on the manufacturing view, so you need to assign that product to the manufacturing asset, and how you do that, that needs to be properly defined in the data hierarchy. So that's a key requirement. The data engine needs to provide the ease of aggregation and disaggregation into different hierarchy and views. And you define the roles, the master planner, master production scheduler, asset scheduler. You really need to look into the APIX model to really kind of understand how you define the work, because the different work needs to be defined properly so that the hierarchical planning kind of works on a smooth basis. And you definitely need to design the business process, the demand planning, aggregate supply planning. We kind of touched upon that in a little bit by laying out some of these steps within the chevrons that we sort of displayed in that wiring diagram. But that needs to be detailed out, like who does what, when, what gets communicated when. These are all things that needs to be properly defined. So that essentially concludes my presentation. Hope you have at least gotten something. If you need any help, obviously we are here to answer your question and help you put together a plan on how you implement the hierarchical planning. And thanks for the opportunity.
All right, so Teban, I would like to quickly jump in here since we just have 8 minutes more to go. We have a lot of questions flowing in right now, and that is so exciting, which means that the topic for today's presentation was very awesome, and our audience are really very interested in it. So I want to tell our audience that if we are not able to address your question during today's session, I personally promise you that we would be following up with you through email to make sure we answer your question. So let me just quickly jump into the first question that came in today. The question is about gap closing. So for the gap closing exercise during MPS, how are the gaps known? Which is the first question. And also, does Akiva provide a list that needs to be addressed? So I'll take the question again just so Tepan, you can get it. So for the gap closing exercise during MPS, how are the gaps known? And also, does Akiva provide a list that needs to be addressed?
So again, so you need to look at the Akiva provides a report, and in that report you will see that there are unfulfilled demand for either because of the lack of raw materials or a lack of capacity, or so. So you need to look into the report and do some analysis to see what is the root cause. And so you may have to work with the raw material planners, the DRP planners, and others. And so that's why the gap closing is a very key aspect of the hierarchical planning process. I mean, without the gap closing, really, you would not know like where you are falling short. So it is one of the key steps in our demand planning, in our hierarchical planning process. And Akiva does provide the support for effective gap closing sessions.
Awesome. Okay, so the second question again here is what optimization tools are used for the final run of the aggregate plan and then to optimize the schedule in continuous time? The question again is what optimization tools are used for the final run of the aggregate plan and then to optimize the schedule in continuous time?
So for this particular example, let's start with the aggregate planning. So in aggregate planning, we created some like an aggregate product structure and all that. So we use the mixed integer linear program for aggregate supply plan. Also for MPS, also we use some kind of like a optimization based heuristics which is based on the mixed integer linear program, but we use some kind of a heuristics to solve the MPS. And for scheduling, actually, it is so for this particular business, we use the genetic algorithm. But again, I mean, if your business do not have the like a sequence dependent setup, then you can use something else. So the planning engine should have multiple algorithms under the hood to address the need as needed.
Awesome. So what are the options for aggregation and disaggregation?
I'm sorry, say that again, please.
What are the options for aggregation or disaggregation?
Okay, so the aggregation, disaggregation. So first of all, you disaggregate the product family level demand in monthly bucket into the SKU level weekly bucket. So that is one of the options. In master production schedule, the aggregate planning, you have the product family based quantity, and each product family is composed of, let's say, multiple products. And so we need to make sure that the disaggregation of the product for on the supply side, the sum of the disaggregated product should be equal to the total aggregate product. So I'm not sure if I'm answering you the question right, but on the demand side, it is the demand has two dimensions of disaggregation. One is the time and one is the product hierarchy. And on the supply side, it's really more to make sure that it's not exactly a disaggregation. It's really more ensure that the sum of the breakdown is not, it does not exceed the aggregate supply plan. And that is also done by the asset on which the product is made.
Got it. Also, when you say finance when you say finance owns the ACP, do you mean accountants or business, or the business that owns the P&L?
So this particular business that I'm talking about, so each business has their own finance team, the accountant and the finance manager, and they're responsible for the financial status of the business. It's not the corporate controller, it's the finance person in the business. And this person actually, I mean, they are responsible for running the show, the S&OP show, because the S&OP is the volume. That's what really the supply chain cares about, the demand team and the supply team. However, at the end of the day, your volume needs to translate into a certain amount of revenue and the pre-tax operating income. So that's where the finance comes in. And they actually wants to make sure that the aggregate supply plan, given the volume that we agreed on, it generates the revenue target that is, let's say, is expected by Wall Street. So that's where the finance person comes in, and that's why they actually run the integrated reconciliation and management business review meeting and creates the approved consensus plan, which then gets communicated to the demand team and the supply team.
Got it. So all too soon, we've run out of time and we can't take any more questions. But we want to say thank you all so much for taking the time today to join us. And we hope to connect with you in the next webinar, which will be in a few weeks' time. So thank you so much and have yourself a great day. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you.